This is a Frontier Forum, brought to you by Latitude Studios.
Ahmad Faruqui is an energy economist. He's one of the foremost experts on rate design, and naturally, he's obsessed with pricing.
Whether you're shopping for groceries, you have to decide, should it be Safeway, should it be Costco? You have happy hour pricing at restaurants. You have a lot of variation in airline prices, depending on is it a weekend? Is it a key holiday event? We are all, as human beings, ultimately responding to prices. It's human nature.
Dynamic pricing is everywhere, and it impacts all of us. Whether it's the time of day, your location, or the amount of demand, so many of our decisions are driven by real-time pricing changes. But it's still a relatively new concept in electricity.
We have never thought about conveying that time sensitivity to customers for 100 years. It's only in the last several decades.
The legacy grid, the network of large thermal power plants, was a lot simpler to manage in response to shifting conditions. Consequently, rates were much simpler. But the grid of today, with millions of EV chargers, rooftop solar systems, batteries, and weather-dependent power plants, is far more complex.
And so to be effective in getting to a net zero target, to manage the grid in a situation where you don't have control over the supply of energy in the way that the industry has had for 100 years, now you have to have, as a grid operator, control over demand in a way that you've never done. And what does demand respond to? One of the things, prices, rates, business models.
Scott Engstrom is the co-founder and chief customer officer at GridX, a company that models complex rate designs and creates a single source of truth for utilities. That source of truth is more important than ever. On top of distributed energy, utilities face extreme weather, rising demand, changing customer preferences, and the pressure to decarbonize.
Taking carbon out of the supply of energy will only work if grid operators have the flexibility with respect to demand to meet this new supply stack that utilities are building, some of them faster than others. And so that is why getting rates right, having the right incentives are so important to ultimately achieving that goal.
Without customer involvement, this net zero business is dead on arrival. So we need to have customers be happily participating. We can't have them be unhappy. We can't let them think, we are being forced, like in a communist regime, to do certain things that he otherwise wouldn't do. It has to be shown to be in their own interest.
I'm Stephen Lacey. This week, we're featuring a conversation with Scott Engstrom of GridX and economist Ahmad Faruqui. It was recorded live as part of our Frontier Forum series. We talk about the imperative of good rate design and the consequences of getting it wrong. How do we create dynamic rates that are fair, transparent, and effective at valuing distributed resources? And how do we use technology to design and implement those rates, and perhaps eventually automate them on a real-time basis?
That's certainly a big topic, and certainly why I'm in the business I am, and GridX from a mission perspective really want to be a part of the decarbonizing our industry and contributing to the clean energy transition that's going on. So we think about this a lot.
Suddenly, they are now a hot topic of discussion. Just 5 years ago, you had a webinar with 10 people signed up. Now you have more than 400 people signed up. It is becoming the talk of the town.
So I want to start by maybe poking a little bit, and we're going to get into design and implementation. But if we step back and get like maybe your most provocative take, I'd like to hear from each of you if you have something particularly provocative that you think about rates. What is your most provocative take, Scott?
Well, I wish I was described as provocative more often, but I will do my best here. I think. And I was thinking, rates have been talked about for hundreds of years. So can I come up with a new and interesting take on rates that haven't been? But I do think, hopefully this is provocative, I think that rates are both going to get much more complex and much more simple. I think what's going to happen ultimately is you will have some disintermediaries, or what they're called aggregation service providers, ASPs, that will be sophisticated enough to work with business models that are much more complex today. We'll at some point today we'll talk about these dynamic prices and things like that are very complicated for typical humans who don't pay attention to their bills. They'll get that. But they'll figure out a way to manage the risk around those complexities of the rates, maybe through a trade-off with customers to allow them to control when they charge their EV or move their thermostat around. And those customers may want a very simple rate. Just give me a subscription to a Netflix type rate. And the disintermediator will be able to work with that complexity, manage the risk, and offer us a very simple product to customers. So I think there'll be a wide variety of rates out there, but one of the trends I really believe is we'll have both more complex and more simple rates.
Ahmad, give us your spiciest take.
We have seen a lot of interesting attempts to innovate rates over the last 2 decades. And a lot of them, unfortunately, fall in the category of doing a checklist. Oh, we're going to offer a time of use rate, but we don't know how to design it properly so customers can get excited about it. We don't know how to market it. And so most of these rates have had 1 or 2% of the customers signed up. But yeah, the commission is happy there is a time of use rate. The utility says, yes, I met the commission requirements. So we have to get out of that mindset and really look at examples of other industries. And now within our own industry, there are many successful examples of innovative rates being offered and attracting large numbers of customers. And of course, the other element is technology. Now, the challenge here, the provocative angle here, is we have to do it in a way that appeals to customers. We can't become Orwellian and suddenly become paternalistic and tell them how to live their life. We have to talk to them, listen to them, and design rates that work with each person's individual lifestyle. I think that is the challenge, and that's where a few have succeeded, and many are just not aware of what to do or what not to do. A lot of rate design experts at utilities, honestly, are engineers or accountants. They have very little contact with customers, and the same is true of commissions. They sit in a room in an echo chamber and they make up the rates, and then they wonder why only 10 people have taken it. Oftentimes I ask them, those people themselves who have designed them, are you on that rate? They say, no. Why would we want to be on that rate? So where do you go, right? I mean, it's sort of like, it's a trap. We have to get out of that trap.
And I just want to get some terms right here to inform the rest of the conversation. Ahmad, quickly, when we're talking about time varying rates, so we use time of use and dynamic rates. Can you just talk about the differences in those terms?
Yeah, sure. So a time of use rate simply says it'll cost more during certain hours and it'll cost less during other hours. You will know the prices in advance. You will know the time periods or the buckets in advance. It's kind of static. It does vary by time, but it's the same rate being repeated day after day. It might change in the summer versus winter, but otherwise it is well known in advance. On the other hand, a dynamic pricing rate, you don't know what the price will be in advance, and you don't know when that price will apply. So dynamic introduces a lot of uncertainty that you didn't have in a standard time of use rate.
Scott, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? So if more and more people are paying attention to this, particularly time of use rates, like what are the sources of conflict? What are the sources of issues that utilities are facing? And what does it mean to modernize rate design?
A lot of good questions there. Well, hopefully, in terms of the problem, I made a credible argument about how we need to create demand flexibility to support decarbonization. And so that demand flexibility, as Ahmad and I think agreed on, is, can be driven or should be driven by price signals. That's what gets customers to react to things. Certainly residential customers, as well as commercial industrial customers, will react to those price signals. And so if we say that's where we have to go to reach our targets, that's the problem. The problem relates to that. It's the inertia. It's the very difficult nature of getting people to change, both residential customers who, ultimately, I believe, don't think they're buying electrons from their utility. They're buying convenience. I come home, I turn on my lights, I turn on my air conditioner, it works. They're not thinking about how much am I paying for those electrons at all times. So how do we get that? A lot of customers who don't think about the energy transition or decarbonization to think about price signals for what they otherwise generally think of as a convenience that they're buying from their utility, much like other services. So that's certainly a big challenge. And then you think about large industrial customers who've maybe built built their whole processes and the way their business works around electricity rates that exist today, because electricity is a very high cost of them doing business. So how do we suddenly approach them and tell they need to change or make investments in their manufacturing process to respond to these price signals? So these are very real challenges that we have to deal with. But as a society, if we decide that clean energy and decarbonization is important, we have to figure out ways to work through that. And as Ahmad was certainly alluding to, how do we create really good customer experiences around managing that change, finding ways that either to tell the story to customers or make it obvious for them that there are benefits in making these changes, and being more aware of price differences and those kinds of things. And certainly the utility is responsible to the extent the commission will allow them to educate and engage with customers in a way that helps them understand this. But that certainly is the big challenge, and the problem I think we're dealing with is a system that's been in place with relatively little change, as Ahmad alluded to, for decades and decades. And so figuring that out. In terms of your question around modernization, and then I'm happy to let Ahmad comment more on this. I think to me, I have a low threshold, which is the purpose of rate design historically has been to figure out how do we get the price correct to allow the utility to recover its cost of service. It's a very strange industry we work in, where the market doesn't set the price. The utility says, this is how much it costs me to operate my utility, plus a return on capital, and we have to spread all those costs around our customers. And that spreading that cost around customers was the rate design function. But of course, now we're thinking about rate design differently. How do we incentivize certain behavior? How do we incentivize this load flexibility? So anything that is a shift from that traditional, more accounting, math-based exercise of rate design, I would consider to be modern rate design. But Ahmed's been in the industry longer than me. He may have a different definition.
I think you summed it up very well. I'll make just three comments. One is rate design traditionally has been driven by cost of service. Cost of service has been accounting, financial kind of exercise. There was no intention to change customer behavior. It was simply, here is what it costs. Well, because of the energy transition, because of the net zero goals and the desire for load flexibility, we now have new way of thinking about the role prices can play. Now, as far as customers go, some of them are green. Some of them are into climate change. But currently, most of them are not. Most of them are simply about how do I lower my bill and how do I live my life as I want to live it. So we have to find different ways of messaging the need for change to the different segments. And it all begins with customer centricity. Rate design used to be cost of service driven. Now it has to be customer centric. And that is where these aggregators that Scott was mentioning come in. They understand this better than utilities or regulatory commissions. And that's why they have entered the market in England, in Australia and New Zealand, in Texas. You're seeing companies like Octopus Energy, like OVU, like Kavula. These companies understand customers 100 times better than regulated utilities. They have come in from the outside. They know how to talk and communicate to customers and do the pricing in a way that the customer says, oh, I see, this will lower my bill. Or, oh, I'm going to help in greening the planet. So messaging is as important as the rate design. You can have the best rate design and have terrible marketing and nobody will take it. You go to another utility with the same rate design, they know how to market it, or you go to Octopus Energy, a third party, and that messaging, just think of it like this, all retail business in the United States without advertising and marketing, where would it be? It would be dead on arrival. They have to know how to talk in a language the customer can relate to. And that is something we are really lacking in most regulatory jurisdictions. We have what I'm going to call regulatory speak. Only the regulator and the utility and the witnesses in the hearing room understand each other. The customers, if they were let into that room, would immediately rush out. Oh, this is like a mad asylum. Why was I put in here?
Let's get into rate design, and then we'll get deeper into implementation. So, one of the criticisms of time of use rates is that they don't make a big enough difference to justify the effort. And I'd like to get your thoughts on whether simple time of use rates actually achieve desired outcomes, and if there are any successful programs you can point to where they actually worked. Scott, you want to start?
Yeah, I like this question a lot. We get asked for a lot of these conferences and trade shows to come up with panel ideas, and I think we could do a whole panel just on debating what does that mean, success of a time of use rate. As Ahmad alluded to, we do a rate case. There's all kinds of stakeholders that get involved, and I think each of those stakeholders may have a different perspective on what is a successful time of use rate. So I will give mine, but I recognize that depending on what your role is and how you're participating in this, whether you're a consumer advocate, a regulator, the utility, a customer, all of those people may think, all those personas, if we want to call it that, may look at these programs differently to measure success. I think that the base level, the reason we went down, one of the big reasons we went down the path of putting in smart meters to enable time of use pricing is because everybody recognized that having high peaks at the utility generates extra costs for the whole system that everyone has to bear. It's having a peak plant that runs 10 hours a year but costs millions of dollars that everyone has to pay for is something, if we could avoid through time of use rates, that it pushed that off-peak load onto on-peak load to off-peaks. We could shave that peak. We could save money for everybody across the system. So for me, the baseline was the TOU program successful at lowering the peak, shaving the peak, reducing the need to invest in what were often, dirty fossil plants that serve those a few hours a year. So I think, Ahmad has, through his work with his prior company, has hundreds and hundreds of TOU programs, almost all of which have shown that TOU does push load from on-peak to off-peak. So I think there's ample indication that it works. I think the question becomes, to what extent does it work? Some people, when they hear TOU rates and they find that a utility is investing in rolling them out, they think that's a proxy for solving all the problems. Well, we know TOU rates won't solve all the problems. In fact, I believe there's going to have to be a menu of rates and options and business models that fully reduce the peak. The question, I think, is, does the TOU program meet just a basic cost-benefit ratio? These are generally lower cost demand side programs than, say, demand response or maybe some energy efficiency. Other programs, TOU is relatively low to cost to implement, and that price signal can have really strong results.
So basically, the success of a time of use rate or any kind of time varying rate, including dynamic pricing rate, depends on how much of a savings opportunity does it create for customers. Is it enough to motivate them to move their load from peak to off-peak, or to build a new off-peak load, like buying an electric car? If the rate is not well designed, if it's very diluted, it's just a time of use rate in theory, the peak rate is just 20% higher than the off-peak rate. Or look at it the other way, the off-peak rate is just 20% lower than the peak rate. Nothing happens. It has to be substantially lower. The data that Scott was referring to that I had developed in my previous career, we had data from 400 implementations of time varying rates across the globe. And what we found was that the bigger the savings opportunity, the more will be the reduction in peak load. Now, that sounds like common sense, and it is common sense, but it's empirically validated. It's not just a theory in a classroom that a professor is teaching. It is actual consumer behavior. So if you're only going to lower your off-peak rate by 20%, you're going to get not much reduction in peak. But if you lower it by 80%, you will get a much more substantial reduction in peak. So the price signal has to create a savings opportunity. And that's where you see successes and failures. Part of it is rate design. The other part is marketing. Both are equally important. As I said, you can have the best rate design and market it poorly and nobody will take it. And you can have the worst rate design and market it effectively and everyone will take it.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, Ahmad, I think that it's really interesting, this idea of the on-peak and to off-peak price really is one of the things that drives so much passion around time of use rates. I'm sure you've seen it as well. And, in our industry, we are so worried about customers' bills goes up. Everybody who's involved, from regulators, the utilities, the customer advocates, and rightly so. We should be worried. I mean, the goal of this is not to create higher bills, and that fear can drive sometimes rate design decisions. I'm sure Ahmad has been a part of many of these where, the people walk into the rate case with high hopes, and then they get afraid by the end and they decide to go with a differential that's too small to make much of a difference. And I think that's you asked me about the problem earlier. I think this is part of the challenges. How bold do we want to be as regulators, utilities, customer advocates to say that we'll risk customers' bills going up in exchange for providing a price signal that may ultimately provide them more opportunity to control their bill and lower it. But I just think that's interesting, as Ahmad mentions that on-peak to off-peak ratio.
If I can add just a footnote to what Scott was just saying, it reminded me of an example where I was trying to describe a dynamic price to a utility client. He was a vice president, and there was a number of other people in the room. And with a dynamic price, like critical peak pricing, for a few hours of the year, the price will rise a lot, but it's lower during all of the other hours. So in this example, the price was going to rise to $1 for 100 hours of the year, but it'll go down by a lot during all the other hours. And I was presenting this to him, and he suddenly said, "Why don't you just shoot the customer?" I was taken aback. First of all, I think it's a crime. And secondly, it's not my customer, it's his customer. I said, I don't have a gun, and it's your customer anyway. But I did say to him that, look, we are lowering the off-peak rate. On average, it'll be the same rate if they don't shift anything. He said, I don't care about what you're saying. I'm concerned about not charging a price. So some people get fixated on the high price, and that's understandable. Now, if you go to Macy's or Nordstrom's, when they have their sale, they only talk about the lower price. Everything is on sale, 70% off. People rush. They don't say that on the other days we have a higher price. Why lead with the higher price? Lead with the lower price. I mean, that's like marketing 1A, right? But we somehow, because of the cost of service mindset, can't seem to understand it. But all of us, our customers who go to Macy's, Nordstrom's, and Safeway, learn from that everyday experience and talk in the language of savings and not penalizing the customer.
So you gave me an example of poor design or implementation. So let's actually step back, and when we give some examples here, give me an example of good design and implementation, an example of poor design and implementation, and why. Scott, you first.
Well, one of the first customers we worked with was the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. Most people know them as SMUD. They did some really interesting pilots. They were early to pilot. They piloted a number of different programs, including CPP, as Ahmad just referred to. They really gathered some interesting data about the price elasticity of their customers, and they looked at different on-peak to off-peak ratios and had opt-in and opt-out pilots. So really had developed some really good information about their customers, about a good set of their customers, and then became one of the first real, good-sized utilities that moved to a default opt-out time of day model. And as they approached that, their board made the decision to go down that path. They had good results from their pilot programs. They really invested heavily in marketing, education, outreach, and at helping customers be ready for the transition. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, not too far from Sacramento. They were a customer. I'd be driving up there quite frequently, and they just blanketed the whole. They really invested in helping their customers be knowledgeable. In particular, they plastered everywhere 5 to 8. That was their peak period, 5 to 8. And so they did benefit for those other utilities out there who have very large service territories. This could be a little harder. They certainly benefited from the fact that they had more of a smaller service territory, more concentrated, but they did, given that, they did a really fantastic job, and they've achieved both the load shift that they were hoping for, and they are very acclaimed for their high customer satisfaction ratings and J.D. Power scores, and that has not been impacted by defaulting all of their customers to this new time of use rate. In fact, they've stayed very high across all of those. So that's certainly a really good example.
And what about poor rollout?
Well, we have to call
Well,
people out. I think
you can decide whether you name names or not.
I will say this. So we do monitor things like the EIA databases, which track how many customers have access to time of use rates and how many are enrolled. So we know just across the country that today, well over 60% of customers could be enrolled in a time of use rate, but there's only about 7 or less than 10% are enrolled. So that sort of is an indictment of our industry. And we have, with our data across our customers, we know that many of these customers would benefit just by switching to the rate based on their load shape, but yet they don't. So that's almost an indictment of our industry at large. And I think the reason that these programs fail, we've already talked on a bunch of them. Ahmad has mentioned, in some cases, the price differential is just not enough to get people to care about. And so it's maybe not worth the time to do a phone call or log into the website because the bill savings are not that much differently. The marketing's not there to raise the awareness among the customers that they should even be thinking about this. They just think there's one price. They don't even know the rates available. And so I prefer not to name names because I hope all of these we can help it one day but create successful time of use programs. Some of them, again, maybe their commission has not provided them funding to be effective marketers of these campaigns. So it has to be some recognition from regulators as well that this is to make a great customer experience. You can't just offer a rate. It has to be marketed as well, as Ahmad has said. So I will pass on the specifics, Stephen. Maybe after we turn the microphone off, we can have a longer conversation.
Yeah, sometimes the better conversations are the one in the bar next to the conference, so to speak. But Ahmad, you're recently retired, so maybe you can feel free to actually name names. But I would love to hear your thoughts on good and bad examples, some specific experiences that you've been through.
I should probably write a book on the subject, right? The question is, will anyone read it? Okay, so I'll give you a few examples. Smart, definitely number one on my list in so many areas. They did it gradually. They began with a pilot. Then they did an opt-in. Then they did a massive education campaign. Whenever I would drive to Sacramento for a conference or whatever, on the freeway, I would see billboards with the signs that Scott was referring to. They did it gradually, and their rate is very well developed. The price differential between peak, they have 3 periods, peak to off-peak in the summer, is 2.5 times. In other words, you save a lot during the off-peak period. I wish they had marketed that way, but they chose to not do it that way. But again, everybody can learn and improve. Again, look at Macy's and Nordstrom. Nobody pitches the high price. They always talk about the lower price. But despite all of that, they have 97% of the customers on their default TOU rate. Peak reduction of 4 to 8% has occurred, which is very consistent with our database. Besides MUD, and let me mention 2 other examples, good ones, and then I'll mention a few others. So Oklahoma Gas and Electric, very similar pathway to SMUDs, but their focus was on critical peak pricing, not time of use. They also have time of use, but they wanted a more dynamic response. And so they did a lot of market research, then they designed the rate, then they tested it in a pilot, and then they offered it. 10% of the customers are on it, which looks like a small number, but those 10% who are on it have opted into it, and they have reduced their peak load by 40% because the price really rises, and they are saving 20% individually. So that is a very successful opt-in program. And I've talked to them about doing opt-out, but they keep saying it's Oklahoma, you do not do opt-out. Okay, that's fine, I understand. Then Maryland is another example of success with peak time rebates. I was part of that process. We helped design a pilot. We tested it. We looked at TOU. We looked at CPP. We looked at peak time rebates. The peak time rebate, the price doesn't go up, but you can earn a rebate if you lower your peak. So it's more customer friendly, so to speak. And then the commission decided with the utilities application to have default offerings. So every customer is automatically enrolled in the peak time rebate, and I believe more than 80% of them are actively participating. This is true for both Baltimore Gas and Electric as well as Pepco. So those are 2 of many examples. Now you have in the state of Michigan, you have the state of Colorado, they're all going to default time of use rates, and so far so good. And actually in Fort Collins, Colorado, which is a small municipal utility, I think with 50,000 customers, They actually have mandatory time of use rates, not just default, but mandatory, and it's been fine. Now, to mention a few of the ones that didn't quite make it, and I won't mention names, I think everyone knows who they are. So one of them was in the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest, and around the time of the California energy crisis, they decided, oh, yeah, let's offer time of use rates as the default to all customers who have a smart meter. They had 300,000 out of a million who had the smart meter. So then what they did was they went ahead and rolled it out. But the price differential was tiny. It was 15%. However, the marketing was very intense. And so people were excited and they were shifting their load like crazy. Well, a year went by, and then somebody said, have we saved anything or not? They didn't know. This was 20 years ago. So then a special analysis was run, and it showed that, yes, some people saved a little bit, some people lost a little bit, but nothing really changed. So then there was a public outcry, and the utility was forced to just shut it down. That failure was noticed around the country, and many other utilities, like the ones in Minnesota, et cetera, that were planning to go down that path, suddenly stopped. The good news is that 20 years later, the same utility, with new staff and a new commitment, decided to look at more appealing time of use rates. And I was part of that project. We helped design a pilot with much more significant price differentials. And the pilot was very successful. It has been rolled out. I guess it has been rolled out. The collaborative was very successful. I don't know the results yet, but I know some people who are on that pilot, and they're quite excited about being on that rate. And there are numerous examples of failures in the country where the rate was either had no savings opportunity or the peak period was too long. It was 12 hours long. It was basically all the daylight hours. You're screwed, right? And so why would anybody want to be voluntarily screwed, so to speak? And so long peak periods, insufficient price differential, and bad marketing, those are the hallmarks of failure.
Did the utility benefit from these successful programs? Like, how does the utility and the customer benefit in some of these cases?
Certainly, PSEG on Long Island is in the process of moving from an opt-in pilot to a default time of day program. But that one of the reasons they're doing that, they found in the opt-in program, they sort of got what I call the holy grail, which is they realized system benefits. They had the peak shifting we've been talking about, and at the same time, they had bill reduction. So customers benefited and the system. And so that's really, if you can achieve both of those, you really hit the holy grail for what you want a TOU program to do. And so really excited as they move to roll that out to their whole population. You have to be a little tempered in an opt-in pilot because customers may be self-selecting. They may be the ones who are most flexible. So we'll see how that goes. But early indications are that they found a rate design that works for customers and for the system. That's really exciting. Southern California Edison, we worked with, they measured on one peak day the price signal to time of use customers. This is one of the heat storms in California in August, September, I think, of 2022. But they measured 75 megawatts of load reduction. Just, millions of customers at 1 and 2 kilowatt hours, adds up. I guess I hope that math works. Maybe it's more than that. But, and that was equivalent to the third largest demand response program. So another example, a really successful implementation of time of use rates. That was an opt-out program. And then PG&E, one other quick example that is slightly different than this, they have a new electrification rate that they've been promoting for customers that have EVs and other electrification choices they've made. What we've seen on that rate is the on-peak, off-peak is very extreme for these. Those customers have been able to increase their usage. We're talking a lot about lowering usage, lowering peak. These are customers who are increasing in off-peak periods, yet they're also seeing bill reductions. And this is across customer class, what I think is really exciting. We're seeing this also in low-income customers, where people are often particularly worried about those customers and how they are impacted by things like changing their rate structure to time of use. So lots of really good examples out there. I hope the people who are listening, who are thinking about this, know that there are a lot of successes out there.
Yeah, and that example that you just gave brings us to a bigger question about the broader menu of options. You said that menu is getting bigger. So if we go beyond the time of use rates we've been talking about, we have some questions in here about virtual power plants. You mentioned electrification and electric vehicles specifically. If we think about distributed resource adoption, managing electric vehicles, home electrification, shifting peaks, how is that menu of options changing?
Yeah, I guess I saw that question flash up. So the virtual power plants essentially are about load flexibility. And in some cases, they're also about sending power back to the grid. So if people have batteries, like stationary batteries, they have solar panels and stationary batteries, then if you give them the right incentive, that you will pay them a good sum of money on September 6th of 2022, and we had that 5-alarm fire, and all of us were getting those messages on our phones from the ISO and the governor. If you have more people with batteries, and today the primary batteries I'm thinking of are stationary batteries, but there's talk, as you know, about electric car batteries being potentially part of that portfolio. And the electric car battery could be 70 kilowatt hours as opposed to the home battery, which is, let's say, 10 kilowatt hours. So if those batteries are given an incentive by the grid to send power back to the grid during critical days, critical hours on critical days, they become a virtual power plant. And that could be a huge resource. So that's where, right now, the way the incentives are structured, it is a peak time rebate. You send your power and you're paid for that. It is not the dynamic price of the traditional kind. But the dynamic prices of the traditional kind also makes a big role because you lower your air conditioner usage. You don't charge your electric car when there's that special, alert. What is it called? Zodiac alert? What is the term that's used when they send those, when they ping your phone? So some kind of alert is sent. Well, if you can also have higher prices as opposed to just sending an alert. See, the problem with alerts is they only work a few times. Then it's like the kid who cried wolf doesn't have an impact. You have to make it tangible by giving them a monetary payment or charging a higher price. So variable peak pricing and demand response programs both are part of this portfolio of what is a virtual power plant. And it will require technology advancements. It has to go beyond just a smart thermostat. And I think we are beginning to see that happen. In the next few years, there'll be a lot of batteries, in California at least, with the NEM 3.0 proceedings, and more electric cars. I mean, I was at a gathering yesterday in the parking lot. I was just looking at the cars. Half of them were EVs. Now, I know the Bay Area is very unique in that, but it's a trend that's coming nationally. And just think, if they all charge the cars at the wrong time, it'll be a disaster. But if they all charge them at the right time, it'll be very successful. So how do we make sure people don't charge at the wrong time? Use the price signal.
I've heard from some in certain corners, the really interesting corners maybe of rate design, who say, we shouldn't have device-specific rate designs because we don't know how many devices there'll be, how many technologies there'll be, and maybe we're just going down a wrong path. I don't know what the answer to that is. I think we have some interesting history here to think about, though. If we think about net metering, for example, and we could have a whole webinar on net metering, but I just want to point out for solar adoption, the combination of the time of use price signal with net metering meant, particularly here in California where there was so much adoption, everybody had their solar panels facing south. And today that's a little bit of a problem for the state now because we have oversupply of solar electricity on many days in the spring and fall in particular, around that 12 o'clock time. And so the rate design has changed now to incentivize west-facing solar panels, and obviously NEM 3 or NBT is encouraging storage to go along with that. But I think that is one of the things that hopefully we have smart people who have crystal balls who can see the future in ways that if we go down technology-specific rate designs, as Ahmad just said, that's why I thought it was a really good example. For our EVs, are we setting up challenges by having all millions of customers or hundreds of thousands today focused on activity that will create an externality, some problem down the road? And we certainly need to be aware of that. And so I think ultimately, because of policy reasons and people who want to apply policy over economics and maybe some practicalities of managing the grid, we will see a more abundance of technology-specific rates. I'm thinking about heat pumps, batteries. Certainly, we have EV rates are quite ubiquitous at this point. So I think there'll be an early trend. We may see something like the example I gave with solar panels, all being face south today, that we realize 2, 3, 5 years later we shouldn't have done, and we'll have to course correct. But it certainly seems to me that's the path we're going down.
Well, one comment, if I can make just quickly, technology-specific rates. Some people hate them, and at the traditional utility mindset, it's a no-no. But I think we need to change our thinking. We have to look at the future, the energy transition and net zero. That requires us to encourage the desirable kind of electrification. So how do we do that? Well, what we do is we say, okay, this is your current pattern of consumption. This is your current bill. We can leave it just the way it is. But at the margin, if you electrify through an EV or a heat pump or anything else, we will see the change in your load shape. The AI technology is there, the data science is there, the metering is there. And so your extra use, we're going to charge that at a dynamic price. So you don't have to panic about your existing lifestyle, your existing consumption, but at the margin, you'll get a much lower price most hours of the year. That will really incentivize the adoption of these much needed heat pump and EV technologies. That's an idea that I have been pushing and bringing up. And actually, I've just copied something that Georgia Power has been doing for years for C&I customers. Their RTP program just applies at the margin. It doesn't apply for the base usage. So you don't have panic, oh, my rates will go up, I don't know what will happen to me. You just say, use what you're using efficiently as much as possible, like you always have done, but at the margin, we'll give you a much lower rate. That encourages efficient electrification. And if you have time-varying elements in that, marginal cost-based pricing, everyone's better off. Now, one comment I'll make, which came up earlier and didn't get fully addressed, what is the issue that utilities have? The utilities issue is, I will lose revenue. If everyone shifts their load and lowers their bills, my goodness, my shareholders will hate it. I will be hanged. So what should I do? Then they have decoupling. Decoupling is good up to a point because basically you lower your bill and then they raise the rates so they get the same revenue. It's like a shell game that doesn't go anywhere. We have to change the business model of the utilities. And that's why you're seeing these third parties come in. They don't have this crazy business model. That's why they're being so successful. We have to get out of this mindset of protecting the old business model. We have to realize big changes coming for net zero. We have to have a new way of thinking, not just for the customers, but also for the commissions and the utilities.
This brings us to a conversation about highly dynamic pricing, real-time pricing. So I think that the longer-term vision of many is to create a sort of price-to-device market where you're using this highly dynamic real-time pricing and devices are automatically reacting to the pricing environment. And I would love for your broad takes on if we are headed there. I know California has been considering this for a couple of years. What are the steps to get there? Is that a desirable outcome? And what are potential pitfalls of that?
Yeah, I think the desirable outcome, again, depends on your perspective, who you are. I think if you are flexible load, and so you run a business where you can respond, or you're even a residential customers who has the ability to respond to these price signals, things like dynamic prices are a really great option for you, where, again, you get these win-win outcomes that I think Ahmad alluded to before, where the customer can save money potentially, or at least not spend as much as they would have on another rate or tariff, and they provide system benefits. If you think the duck curve is a California-only thing, then maybe this won't apply. But if you think the duck curve is at least that, maybe it won't be as pronounced in your state or your region, but there will be real benefits to getting customers to take advantage of their flexibility and use energy when it's cheap, it's clean, it's free. And so certainly I think those are all the reasons to do it. The steps to take, there's a multitude of different rate designs. Ahmad mentioned mentioned what happens in Georgia is slightly different than what's happening here in California, but the idea is to provide a price signal that is more tied into the true cost of the energy that's being used from a wholesale, whether that's an ISO level or some wholesale price signal, combined potentially with what's happening locally at the circuit level on the distribution side. I think I saw some questions in here diving into that as well about how do we manage what's going on at the distribution level, what might be happening at the generation level could be different than the needs of the distribution. And then you get into some real complex rate design, but it may be necessary. That may be the way we need to move to get to net zero. And the nice thing is, whether we call them intermediaries or not, somebody can step in and manage that complexity for human customers, because not many humans probably are going to want to think about hourly prices, but they can find agents for them that would be willing to manage that for a price. And that price is like insurance or just the cost of enrolling in a product. So I really bullish on this, not because you and I, Stephen, want to look at our phone every day and see what the next hourly price is, but because somebody will be willing to manage that for us and offer us a product we really like.
There are a lot of very strong opinions on this, Ahmad. I don't want to mischaracterize you, but I think you're a little bit less bullish on real-time pricing. Maybe there's sort of a technological and standards component, and then there's the actual impact on customers. So, what's your take on whether that is the desired outcome?
So I have mixed feelings. I certainly think that customers would like somebody else to manage their bill for them and lower it without there being inconvenience. So they lay out their lifestyle. And a good example of that actually goes back a few years to Oklahoma again. They have prices to devices for 10 years now with their dynamic pricing program. What they do is they send a price signal directly to the thermostat. But it is up to the customer to pre-configure the thermostat to say if the price is at this level, this is the thermostat setting, 2 degrees higher. If the price is even higher, 4 degrees higher, whatever it is, they leave it to the customer to do it. That's very smart. So you could have the same thing with EVs. You could have the same thing with a lot of devices, but it has to be with the customer's concurrence, and the customer's bill has to go down. It shouldn't be Orwellian. It shouldn't be imposed on them by a paternalistic godfather who's saying, I'm going to tell you when you will take your shower, or when your kids will go to school, or when you will cook your food.
If either one of you could make a regulatory change or a utility level change around rate design or implementation, what would it be? What is the biggest source of conflict or needed change that you think you would shift? Scott?
Well, if I was the czar of utilities, utility commissions, and rates, a position that I don't believe is open today, but if they ever made it available, I would ask that we just try more. We embrace a failure a little bit. I'm not saying we waste money and do things frivolously, but we don't know really what's going to really work with customers, as Ahmad said. We need to figure out what customers embrace. And so we have to try some things to find that out. And so there has to be some willingness to invest some money to say, we need to get to a net zero decarbonized world. And we're going to have to try a lot of different things and see which ones work, which ones our customers like. And so I would love to see that idea of failing fast. And there's lots of bad Silicon Valley examples of this, not necessarily in that way, but in a way that recognizes that we don't know what we don't know yet. So let's, as an industry, try different things with different customer groups to see what does work.
Absolutely. I think we have to be prepared for failure. I mean, all of the tech companies, all the different products they have, many of them were arrived at after a lot of failures. So the problem with our regulatory model, unfortunately, is again the issue. It is very risk averse and it's very revenue focused. It is not customer centric. And when I presented on customer centricity at a major utility in the Midwest a few years ago, the first question I got from the chief operating officer was, what's in it for us? I mean, the person failed to comprehend the benefits of being customer-centric. And I said, what do you mean? He said, where's the revenue? So the revenue centricity mindset has to be replaced with a customer centricity mindset. And why? Because that is in the planet's interest. We have to go beyond our selfish, narrow interest to looking at the planet and looking at customers. I mean, I was truly stunned when I heard that person say, what's in it for us? Can you imagine Nordstrom's CEO saying to somebody who says, our marketing research shows this and this, and the person saying, what's in it for us? I mean, that'll spell doom.
This conversation was recorded live as part of Latitude Media's Frontier Forum with GridX. This is a partially edited version of the conversation, so if you want to go watch the full video with all the listener questions, head on over to latitudemedia.com/events and click Watch Recording. And if you want to read some additional coverage about innovations in rate design, we'll have some links in the show notes. And go to latitudemedia.com/events to see what else we've got coming up. And thanks so much for listening.